meet my local federal representative and discuss some of the issues I was facing. And there's this really powerful saying that you cannot be what you cannot see. And this program gave me the opportunity to meet powerful and really inspiring role models. So not only did I form a network with really amazing women, but what really changed my life was the sense of empowerment that I felt at the end of it. So I returned to my community knowing who I could contact and how to raise awareness for the needs of my community. And I was really confident enough to access the media and advocate for the needs of my community. And together with other women in my area, we worked really hard to draw attention to our issues that we had with inconsistent power and the poor telecommunications. And we ultimately got changes made. We now have power generators in our nearest town that enable the town to have running water and access to fresh, safe food when their power goes out. And we also have new telecommunication towers that enable me to talk now. So ultimately, our issues were resolved through people, mostly women, raising their voices together across a huge number of platforms to be heard.
So do you believe that it was your involvement with the communications reference team that assisted you and the broader community to achieve those goals?
Yeah, I really do. So many of the small things that I've been able to achieve in my community, I attribute to the skills and the confidence that I gained through the CRT, through the communications reference team, and the National Rural Women's Leadership Muster. I wouldn't have known about the opportunity if I hadn't have been able to get that information through the communications reference team. They were actively sharing the news, and that overlapped with my networks. Therefore, I think the CRT was really a valuable resource, and I do attribute it to what I've been able to achieve.
That's excellent. Thanks, Pip. Bernice, you actually bring a unique perspective to this discussion, given that you are a proud Aboriginal woman. You live in regional Australia, but do a lot of work in cities and conversely also in remote communities, which gives you an insight into the communications barriers faced by our First Peoples, and particularly First Peoples women living remotely. What would you say is the biggest barrier to communications for rural, regional and remote First Peoples women?
Thank you for that question, Jo. Traditionally speaking, when we have conversations about communication barriers in rural areas, what will come to mind is what Pip had talked about, having internet, the technology, communication towers, how fast broadband network can upload, download information to the outside world. So to speak, in the far off distance, the remoteness of isolation, that at times it's only possible via satellite dishes to communicate. Yes, that is a layer to the communication barriers faced. So in saying that, in retrospect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, I would say that the biggest barrier to communication is the isolation and remoteness. This can interfere with every reason for disadvantages because they cannot tap into resources such as for education, health, for raising issues and awareness, social isolation, interaction for themselves, for their family, and for their community. And with isolation and remoteness, the biggest communication barrier, this can impact on being silenced from speaking up or speaking out if and when faced with harmful intergenerational trauma, which is affecting their community, their family, and themselves, which in turn depletes their right to participate in the public decision-making. The way the language and systems are designed today is to suppress not being heard or heard, but not listened to, or to be culturally acknowledged.
So Bernice, when we were having a chat, or as you would probably say, having a yarn, and I know that you're probably going to use that word at some point, so I thought I'd introduce it now. So having a yarn is having a chat, having a talk together. you mentioned that you felt you were able to give a voice to the voiceless. Can you explain that to us?
Yes, when you're talking about having a yarn, through a cultural lens, a yarning circle can bring that to the table where we can meet and it be a culturally safe space to talk and to have conversations that are non-judgmental. So in saying that, when you experience violence, that impacts greatly on breaking your spirit, your identity to be proud of who you are, isolate you, silence you. The weight of shame, fear, and low self-esteem can darken even the brightest day. I speak here today and echo my voice through feeling the spiritual connection of my ancestors, where my strength to be courageous stems from a strong bloodline of women. I know it isn't easy to seek support and begin on a journey that I know in their time faced communication barriers to participate in the decision-making in public life. I am the voice for the voiceless because facing fear head on, I found my voice.
Excellent, thank you. I guess the other thing too that I know that you mentioned to me when we were having that yarn was about skin and kin, because the interesting thing about Aboriginal culture is that you don't necessarily have to be bloodline to be seen as being family. And I think that's a really interesting thing that we have to also remember. Given that for many First Peoples, English may be a second or third language, in fact, in your experience, does that add a layer of complexity that further isolates women living in rural and remote locations?
Yes, this can absolutely add a layer of complexity that can further isolate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women living in those remote locations. So for example, if they're attending to hospital for maternity reasons in regional areas that is thousands of kilometres away from their community and family, and English being a second or third language to them, that the emphasis of numeracy and literacy can be complex and isolating, and in turn can impact greatly to their holistic healthcare outcome when attempting to communicate with hospital staff. So to give you an overview, there is over 400 nations and over 200 language dialects across Australia. And in my Wanyi nation, there is at least 5+ nations that are side by side to each other. And as Joe had spoken about before, is separated by skin, kin, and language.
Oh, that's a powerful message, Bernice. Thank you. Mel, are you with us and able to hear us?
Hello, Joe. Yes, I am. Lovely to see you. Yes,
fantastic. Thank you. You absolutely proved a point about communication barriers in the bush. That's for sure.
Yes.
And I guess that's something I should explain too. When we talk about the bush, we mean Triple R Australia, so rural, regional, or remote Australia. But we often shorten that, as Aussies do. We shorten everything to the bush. Mel, you also bring yet a different perspective. I know that you grew up in the city, but now live in regional Australia with, from what I understand, not a lot between you and Antarctica, just a whole lot of ocean. So you have the ability to understand the needs of both urban and regional women and can see the differences of need in regional areas as opposed to those of our city sisters, for instance. Given that, what do you see as the unique communication barrier faced by regional women? And does that differ from those of our city sisters?
Very much so, Joe. Thanks for that. Yeah, I do think I bring that that unique perspective. I was well into my 30s when I moved to regional Victoria, where I now live, and I must say I do still live in a large regional town, and I guess for comparison, that's around 40,000 people. So we do have good facilities overall, but as is very well illustrated this morning, sometimes the internet and other things still don't work for us very well. So that's still an issue. I think people still need to remember that we even in a big town that I live in, there are still internet challenges. The tyranny of distance is another one. I know in your introduction you've mentioned the size of Australia and the travelling that most Australians that live in regional, remote and rural Australia excuse me, do undertake regularly for work or for professionals. So for me, it's not unusual to drive 2 hours to a meeting, have the meeting for a couple of hours, and then come home. So distance is still a challenge for Triple R people. For Triple R women, then you add on aspects such as your safety. You may not want to be driving on your own early mornings, evenings. If you are young, you're under 18, you don't have a driver's license, or you don't have capacity to have your own car, you've got to take public transport. The town that I live in, we only have 3 trains a day to the main town, to the main city again. So you're limited there. Your access to training, to professional and personal development, it is less. It's changed maybe in the last 12 months with what we've gone through with the pandemic and more online access. But yeah, I definitely noticed that there are less opportunities. And sometimes even if you have the same opportunity, it's substantially harder. If you want to go to Melbourne for a training session, then instead of being 9 till 5, it's going to be 2 days over, 2 nights staying over, and so it's more money, more time, more organising of the rest of your life. So they're the changes I see. For where I come from, in my day job, I've really noticed that access to information and knowledge is one of the key things that is hardest for regional, rural and remote, or to say Triple R, it's easier, women. I work in government in my day job, and I really realised in the last couple of years since joining the National Rural Women's Communications Reference Team that I'm in a unique position to have access to a lot of information and understanding how government works. And as you and I have talked about, in Australia, there's 3 levels of government, and I'm in the middle one. And it's quite complex if you don't deal with it regularly. So I think I'm in a unique position to help people do that and provide that, which we do through the CRT, that access to information and knowledge. So I've said to you, knowledge, access and networks, I think are my 3 key things for Triple R women, and I think that's what the CRT does, and that's what I hope I bring to the CRT.
I think that's a really good point, that the CRT actually increases the outreach of the National Rural Women's Coalition. So each of us use our own networks in order to extend that reach. So Triple R women are able to have that communication, and hopefully some of the barriers that they face are broken down. When you say you live in a town of 40,000 people, I'm always stunned. I live in a village of 600 people, which includes the outlying farms. So yes, it's kind of a very different approach. You know I drive 25 kilometres or 50 kilometre round trip to do any shopping, and I know Pips is longer. So it's interesting. It's that almost sounds luxurious to me, to have a town of 40,000 people, but still very interesting to note the issues that you're facing in a large regional community. And I know that Bernice has the same issues where she is in Townsville in Queensland as well. You've mentioned knowledge and information is incredibly important in your view. And clearly that's something, excuse me, that's something that you are bringing to the CRT, and that knowledge does actually help us to increase that outreach for sure and for certain. What are some of the initiatives that you've been involved with that you believe have really made a difference in breaking down the barriers that we face in Triple R Australia? And if you can give a little bit of background context if you need to.
Certainly. So there's a number that we've really worked hard on in the last 12 months going through the pandemic, and the one that I have been involved in is some online or e-book clubs. So what we thought in National Rural Women's Coalition was that women particularly bear the brunt of a lot of the stress. We're isolated at home during COVID, the stress of perhaps homeschooling, just all added to the the ask of Triple R women. And so we thought, well, what's something that we could do to give them a bit of stress relief, bit of something that's not related to the work or the farm or the family, just for them. So we put out a call for book clubs all over Australia and got a really positive response. So I facilitated one of the book clubs. We had about 15 people start up, women from all different backgrounds, ages, all over the country. And we began the first couple of book clubs with a wellbeing exercise. And then we just talked about books, and then we stopped talking about books. And these continue still, where we've moved them to Facebook, which has been really beneficial. And so that's been a really successful campaign that came because of COVID, but I think will probably morph into something else and may stay longer term. Joe, I have been one of the lucky ones to go through the National Rural Women's Coalition muster program. I completed that a couple of years ago, and I think Pip and Bernice will talk, if they haven't already, about the confidence that gave them and the capacity it gave them to do more work in their community. I certainly increased my networks, my understanding, and again, my confidence to go out there and advocate and share and talk to more women, and massively increase my networks. Some of them in person. It's quite funny. You go to Canberra, the seat of government, and then you come back and you connect with someone that lives around the corner from you, but you wouldn't have met them if you hadn't gone to that program. So I found that incredibly beneficial and enjoyable. Another one that we've done to help with COVID is our photo competition. So what we wanted to do is show rural women in a different view, in a different way, not just your stereotypical farmer's wife or on the land. So we had a photo competition to ask people to show us what your Triple R woman looks like, and that was really, really successful.
Mel, can I just ask you to stop right there? Can I ask whoever is currently speaking to please mute your microphone? Jagoda Janawi, can you please mute your microphone? Thank you very much. Sorry, Mel, back to you.
So yeah, we had a photo competition, Joe, and again, that was helping us break down some of those barriers and the stereotypes that might still exist about Triple R women and what they do and what they don't do. And so we asked people all over the country, send in your Triple R image, and the breadth and variety was really fantastic. And so we've shared them across our social media platforms and so forth, and uncovered probably some great photographers. And for me, I think I've said this too, it was really, at a personal level, it was quite amusing. I have a very close friend who doesn't really identify as a Triple R woman, even though she is. And she entered an image and won. And so now I've got her connected to National Rural Women's Coalition and engaged. So I saw that as a real win.
Yeah, that's phenomenal, actually. And you know, that's one of the things that I think there is that misconception. There are a couple of misconceptions, I think, about Triple R Australia. One is that we're all filthy rich, and that's absolutely not the case. There's a great deal of poverty in the bush, just as there is in other places. I guess the other thing too is that there's this misconception that we're all farmers, or exactly. Indeed worse, farmers' wives. Reality is we're not. We might be farmers, technologists, nurses, doctors, dentists, winemakers, shoemakers, you name it. That's us in Triple R Australia. So I think what you've just been talking about has actually helped to perhaps break down some of that misconception about what we all do. And I think that's a really important thing. I know even within our own country, there is that perception. When we do go to Canberra, which is the seat of government, our federal capital, I think there is some surprise that Triple R women look like we for some reason there seems to be this expectation that we're going to, walk in with the big boots and the farmer's hat on. Well, that's not us necessarily.
No, and I have shared that story with you, Joe, of attending a meeting, which was to do with Australian rules football, which is very big in the town that I am from, and sitting next to this lovely gentleman, and he asked me if I was here with my husband, and I said, no, I'm not. Then he asked me what I do. Am I a teacher? Am I a nurse? And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, oh, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm actually about to stand up on stage and chair this meeting. So again, it's just about that perception. And once I did that, he came up to me afterwards and shook my hand, and we were great pals afterwards, and there's certainly no harm done. But yeah, it's that perception of what our role continues to be.
Absolutely. So yes, I must admit I faced that too. I got to the point when I first came to live in the country. I was born and raised in the bush, and then I went away, and when I came back, because I looked like a city girl, I had a few issues, a few barriers to actually have to break through. And so I got to the point, I didn't tell anybody what I did in my day job because it just became a bit too hard to explain. So I think that barrier is beginning to be broken down too. There is that realization that we do all those kind of different things. Now I'd like to go back and just do another round of questions for everybody in relation to your role with the CRT. What is it that attracted you to become part of the CRT? Pip, you've answered it a little bit, but I'm sure there's some more detail to go into there. And what has it brought to you personally, and what do you think it's brought to your broader network?
For myself, I was attracted to becoming part of the communications reference team because I saw the value in spreading the word for other people in rural and remote and regional Australia. So as a young woman, I felt very disempowered, and I think we all know that when you give someone some information, you do empower them and you equip them with the tools, some of the tools that they can really run with and make change with. And that was certainly my experience. And I really see our role as being a tool to keep rural women informed about really important issues that can actually make a huge difference in their own lives and in the lives of their whole communities. There's that saying that, you equip a woman and you can change the trajectory of their whole community. And I think that's really true. So I see the model of the CRT as one of really pushing information to the wider public and then feeding those understandings back in a way that really helps decision making. And so I guess to sum up, for me, the CRT, I see us as a conduit to power and a pathway to and from decision-making bodies for women in rural, regional and remote Australia. And I think that's just such a powerful thing. That's certainly why I'm part of the CRT, and that's what I see our value as.
Thanks, Pip. Well put. Bernice, what about you? Same question.
Cool.
Sophia Guillaume, could I ask you to please mute your microphone, Sophia?
Yes, thank you, Joe. Thanks, Pip, for that. What I'd like to share with you on that is that a quote by Nova Peris, first Aboriginal female parliamentarian in Australia. She quoted, "As a child growing up, she dreamt big. Most people would have looked at an Aboriginal girl from the Northern Territory, where the statistics point to every reason why she would not succeed. but she was determined to be successful. So in saying that, just like Nova's determination to push through the cycle of what defines success, I stand strong for my generations now and in the future, to give a voice for the voiceless, because it's that sense of self-empowerment with advocating actively from having the tools and resources attained when undertaking a leadership course with the National Rural Women's Coalition. That's given me confidence to now speak not just in my community or a local level or a state level, national, now having the confidence to speak here on a global platform. And that my story provides for a ripple effect to echo out there the importance of what it is for us to be determined to not only push through the cycle, but for myself to be a cycle breaker and a leader for my children, my family, and my community.
So you're actually being a role model for the next generation, essentially, Bernice.
Yes, to begin to eliminate that cycle of intergenerational trauma so that it can allow for that ripple effect to shift in a positive way of self-empowerment, but also in a way where we are also continuing on our culture, that it is so important to be able to still address the past history, but the past history in a way where that is taken and put into setting a framework for the challenges that we are facing each day and every other day.
Thank you. Mel, back to you. Are you with us, Mel?
I am,
Come
Jo.
in, Mel.
Yes.
I feel like I'm contacting the other world. You're like, come in, Mel. So, you know, you've spoken quite a bit about how you feel about, you know, what, for instance, NRWC's muster program gave you, the Women's Leadership Program. So what did the CRT more specifically give to you, and what do you think you've been able to be the conduit for, if you like?
Well, I must say, Jo, the reason I came on, well, I found out about the CRT was as a young woman that probably many people on this call would know. And I just kept seeing her on social media and I just thought she was amazing. So it was probably a bit of an inspiration thing, a bit of a, oh, she's pretty good. Listening to what Pip and Bernice is saying, for me, it's again about the information sharing. And I really felt that what I do in my paid employment, I could bring something to the CRT. We talk about how it's networking, information sharing, but one of the things, and I've touched on this before, is there is so much information. Sometimes there's just too much. And if you go online or you start talking to people, you're just bombarded with it and you're just not sure what is the good information or the right information. So I really think a role the CRT plays is sharing that trusted information. So coming from trusted sources, and we're a trusted source. So women can follow what we provide and share with them and know that it's factual, it's safe, it's relevant, it's all positive for them. And so I think that's a role that we play. And if you just think just what we bring individually when we all come together, that one person can't be across everything that's going on today. So we all come from different places, different backgrounds, different interests, different passions, and it all comes together, I think, to provide this really great overview for Triple R women. And they can get on our Facebook, or they can join our events or take part in the muster program and feel really supported and know that they've got safe factual information. I think that's really important. And that's probably the reason I came on board. I just think there is a lot of good support out there for women. It's just accessing it and getting a bit of help, you know, if it's writing a grant or an application or applying for a program like the Muster. And I feel that I have skills and I can help people do that.
That's terrific. And I guess for me, when I became a board member for the National Rural Women's Coalition and you know, at a board meeting, it was, oh, Jo, why don't you know, you're involved in communications in your day job, being a chief security officer. Why don't you take on the CRT and kind of oversight the CRT, the communications reference team? I went, yeah, sure. No idea what I was getting myself into, right? None at all. But what I found was about sharing the positive stories from the bush, women in the bush, that really made me feel so good. And listening to the women on the CRT, just their experiences, sometimes, you know, things that I hadn't thought of, even as a person from the bush, I hadn't thought of some of these things. So I found it really quite, in some ways, inspiring, and some ways confronting almost too. So that's, you know, that same but different, you know. So it was really interesting, and I love that notion of creating safe spaces, you know. And I think we did that during the worst of the pandemic in Australia through the e-book clubs, for instance. You know, that was a wellness check for women as well. You know, we were checking on how other women were, and if they weren't turning their cameras on, was there a problem? Because we know that there was a rise in the amount of domestic violence in Australia, and so it was during that time. So it was a really good way of just checking on people too. The other thing too was the commonality for me. The commonalities that we all share as R women has been fascinating to me. You know, it doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter where you're situated, there are commonalities that we share, and that's a great thing to talk about. And I guess the other thing that we should mention too is the fact that we four have formed a really strong bond in getting to the point of presenting this early this morning, but we've never met. We've never physically met one another, but I think we have a bond of sisterhood that won't now be broken. And we're definitely from different backgrounds, different age groups, different locations. So to me, that's a really strong thing as well. It's more than just creating our professional personal networks. It's about creating long-term connections. And for me, I believe that women create strong connections that rarely break. So I'd like to thank each one of you for that. That's pretty sensational. I can see a few questions starting to come through, which is fabulous in the chat. If you continue to put them in there, I'm just going to ask my wonderful CRT members whether they have one last comment to make each before I do my wrap up and we go to questions. Pip, have you got one last thing you'd like to say to us about, if there was only one thing you could tell us about CRT, what would it be, and challenges in the bush for communication?
I think, as we've heard from all of us this morning, I think one of the really important things to remember about communication barriers is that they're not just, you know, physical or technological. And I think that's really something that I've really developed an understanding of. And so the power of the CRT is, or the communications reference team, is that we can access so many different areas and, you know, nooks and crannies, I guess, you know, little different places of Australia. As all the women on here would know, we are across the world, we are so diverse, and that's no different in Australia. So the power of the CRT is that we can access and celebrate those differences and then feed that really important information back so that people in decision-making, you know, places of power can actually be informed and consider all of us when they're making those decisions that really do affect our lives.
Terrific. Thank you. Bernice.
Thank you, Pip. Thank you, Jo. I would just like to add through a cultural lens that by identifying the terms of gender equality to articulate not just a women's right, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's right to challenge the conservative way of setting the framework. So with us, like how you said, how we come together here, it diminishes a little bit on feeling isolated and feeling disconnected, because we are able to build those relationships around networking and connections, and able to feel more confident in being able to speak up and speak out about issues that we face in our communities. And in particular, communication barriers have many layers.
Thank you. And Mel?
The CRT, for me, Joe, I just find it such a positive force. It's not asking anything of women. You don't need to do anything. You can just follow us, be with us, talk to us. I just think it's really, it's such a welcoming group. You talked about how we've gone through this journey, the four of us together, and my fun this morning trying to get on, and just the messages that I've got from people saying it will be all right. I just find it a really life-affirming force, and we've talked about the confidence that it brings women, and that's that word that keeps coming up all the time, the confidence for us to put our hands up and try something different, or have our say, and it really it gives you that confidence. And I hope that what we do gives more Triple R women that confidence to put their hand up.
I do too. I think that's a really good summation. I know I certainly encourage those younger women who are sort of coming up the ranks behind us to actually come and join us, stand toe to toe with us, shoulder to shoulder, because it's the only way we're going to see lasting difference, lasting change for women, regardless of where they are, but certainly in the bush. Now, as I said, I like to do a bit of a wrap up, and what I hear is not necessarily what other people hear, but it really is what I've heard and learnt today from my amazing colleagues. One of the things that was really a powerful statement was about, this is really about women helping other women. So, and that might be helping them to get access to government, and, to me, I don't think there's, or to services, in fact, I don't think there's any power like that of women empowering other women. Bernice mentioned that not having the strength to be courageous, to speak up, can be a real issue in Triple R Australia, particularly for First Nations women. And as a result of that, there needs to be a level of resilience to become the voice of the voiceless. The other thing too is that the barriers that we each face in Triple R Australia are practical, perceived, and there are real social barriers as well. And that's not least of all because of the tyranny of distance and the lack of transportation and the like. One thing we are beginning to see that we didn't mention, but that we've all talked about before, is that we are actually beginning to see more women in local government. We're beginning to see more women in rural general practitioner, doctors' practices and dentist surgeries. So there is beginning to be a very slow gender balance change in Triple R Australia. But I do have to say it is glacial in speed. Because the CRT increases the NRWC outreach, the National Rural Women's Coalition's outreach, it also does that for each of us who are involved as well. Normally, and we, as we've said before, we four have been talking a lot as a result of putting this presentation for you together today. And we've had to deal with all of those problems with communication issues, phones being out, phone towers being down, so there is absolutely no communication. Zoom having a fritz, or whatever it might be. Having a fritz means breaking down. All of those things happening to us. So it has been an interesting journey, shall we say. One of the most important things that the Communications Reference team does is to assist women through the auspices of the National Rural Women's Coalition to be a conduit to decision-making bodies, and indeed to the highest level of decision-making in this country, which is our federal government, our federal parliament. You know, I think each one of us here have had practical successes of breaking down barriers, and as Bernice spoke about, the flow-on effect that that actually has to our communities. You know, we've become quite good at identifying the issues, and as a result of the boosted confidence through being a part of this particular group and working together, we've really been able to break down barriers for women, and we believe to make a difference for them. Another thing that Bernice mentioned that I think is a very powerful comment is about facing fear head on, staring fear down in order to find your own voice, to have that confidence to speak up, and to be a woman leading other women in order to make that difference across the community. These are incredibly powerful statements and things that each one of us here have actually found has happened to us as a result of our connection to the CRT and the National Rural Women's Coalition. You know, Pip mentioned that as a result of her involvement with the Muster, the Women's Leadership Program, that she finally got to meet her federal government parliamentarian, her representative, who back in her home remote electorate, she may never have had that opportunity. And as she also said to us, you cannot be what you cannot see. So we believe in showcasing country women, rural women, regional women, remote women, to show their extraordinary strengths and the extraordinary achievements that they've had whilst having to overcome the issues of living in the bush. Another thing that Bernice mentioned too was to speak up and to speak out. This is a learned experience. This is not something I think we're naturally born with, you know, so perhaps some of us are, some of us can talk more than others, but really we do have to learn to speak up and speak out. It might be shocking for you to know that I'm the very quiet one in the corner at a party. It's true, or a big gathering. That's when I go into my shell and I have to find the courage to speak up and speak out about even the most minor things. So our role really is to eliminate barriers as much as we possibly can. And as a result, I think we've created for some women unintentional success stories. I think Mel had a powerful statement too when she was talking about helping women sorting through the absolute plethora of information that we get bombarded with on a daily basis. And so knowledge is power, but knowledge can also be confusing. So it's absolutely essential to make sure that we have somebody like Mel who can actually sort through the red tape and present a really simple scenario to us. Creating networks. That's what we four have done, as well as our broader community. And so I would just like to say finally that the CRT has, as far as I can see, succeeded in its charter to try to help to break down those barriers of communication in the bush for women. So thank you, ladies, and now let's go to questions. Some lovely comments too, thanking us for the interesting discussion about challenges for women in Australia in the bush. What is the accessibility in terms of technology, access to telephones, smartphones, internet, and other means of communications? Because building knowledge and skills is also dependent upon their access to and control over technology. Pip, let's go to you first, seeing as you've had recent experience here.
I think that's a great question. It's so true. If you don't have access to communication technologies in this modern age, it can present a huge barrier to your participation in public life, especially as a rural or remote woman. In my experience, I can really only speak in my experience and the people that I know. I certainly know that it can be, while a lot of us have access to the technology, we might all have access to a smartphone. Most people do in my community. Having the means to pay for internet or access the sites and the areas that you need to can be a huge barrier. I'm currently studying to be a teacher, and I know that as a regional person or a remote person, not being able to go to a library or access high-speed internet can be such a barrier within Australia, and that's something that I know that the government is actively working to address. They're currently really working on the national broadband network, so it is starting to be addressed, but I think there's still a long way to go within my communities to really create a sense of equality and access those technologies. Yeah.
I think also the issue that I know in my own experience that I face is that I can walk to the end of the driveway and I might be, you know, walking with somebody who's got a different provider, different telecommunications carrier, and one of us will have connectivity, but the other one won't. So as far as mobile phones are concerned. So we have large black spots in this country, which is a real issue. Certainly around my little village, there are spots where you can get mobile phone coverage, and sometimes I feel like I have to go up on the roof and do a bit of interpretive dance to get a signal, and that's kind of the reality. Now, ladies from regional Australia, I'm going to go to Bernice first because we know Mel had issues coming in to the call today. So Bernice, what about you? Do you experience issues with phone and internet coverage where you are?
Yes, unfortunately we do. Living in a regional area here, you could be 10 kilometres away from the city centre, but yet have really poor connectivity because of the way that the towers are positioned here to be able to connect to your service provider. As Joe had pointed out, that there could be, you could be on a different broadband network, and that can really play a pivotal strength in how your strength and your connectivity is, or how poor it is, because of that, just by living 10 kilometres away from the city centre.
Makes perfect sense. Mel, now tell us your story on that one.
Look, I'm going to reiterate exactly what Pip and Bernice have said. Yes, we do all have fundamentally access, and Australia-wide there is coverage, but it's not consistent, and there's access and there's access. I can be in the middle of my large regional centre and still struggle. The next day it can be fine. I can drive 5 kilometres out and I have access, but if you're on your smartphone, it's one bar, so you can't download any big documents, you can't be on Zoom meetings, for example, you can't do telehealth, so really crucial things. Commerce can't run programs that they need to, so yeah, it's still a massive challenge.
And I think just to explain telehealth, there's a push in Australia for regional, rural and remote Australia that you should be able to make an appointment to see a doctor or a specialist, say a surgeon or another kind of specialist doctor, a physician, and do a call with them like this, do a Zoom call, and that we're calling that telehealth. And so there's a real push because we have a real shortage of doctors in country areas, and that's one way of resolving the issue, is doing that first consult by telehealth, by telephonic means. So that is a really interesting point. There's another question here. This is a very interesting one. I'd like to ask you about the situation of violence against women in rural areas. Are there shelters for victims of domestic violence in rural areas? This lady is from Japan, and in Japan, especially women in rural areas don't like to be known as victims because the community is so narrow and they tend to hesitate to seek help. Would you tell me about the circumstances around violence and help seeking in rural Australia? Bernice, do you have anything to tell us in that regard, particularly in relation to remote communities?
Thank you for that question. Is it Naomi? Yes, it's domestic violence is no stranger to anyone, and it is quite rife no matter where you are, but in particular in rural areas or remote areas and communities. There is limited resources around being able to access shelters, because if you live in a community of say 500, or you live in a community of 1200, or even a community of 100 in those remote areas, it can really disadvantage you from seeking that right support, because as I hear what you're saying about not wanting to be known as a victim, because it does become a shame factor, and fear for that, for the lives of the women that, and even their children, to be able to access proper help through shelters that are available. And it is something that I know there is training being increased around supporting that, so that it is able to help those living in those rural areas to what they need to do to be able to shift themselves from those situations. And in the regional area where I am in Townsville, they do have I won't say quite a few, I will say a couple of centres that are available for women in those circumstances that are able to access and help them through, so that they are, and by means of that, it's not just a shelter for them to feel safe in. It is also where they are able to network and build on their capacity of shifting from those circumstances that they have endured.
Thank you, Bernice. I know in where I am, for instance, the nearest shelter is 130 kilometres away. So, you know, for women who are facing issues of having to get out of a violent situation, it's very difficult. One of the other things our telecommunications providers were looking to do was to remove old-fashioned phone boxes, and we still have 16,000 of them in Australia. It's not actually a lot for a country this size. And one of the things those telephone boxes actually provided was a safe place for women if they were running from a situation. They would get themselves into a phone box, barricade themselves in. They could actually make the phone call that they needed to a domestic violence helpline or to the police to give them assistance. They had a light over their head, so they were actually able to be seen and they were visible until help arrived on the scene. So our telecommunications providers were trying to take those away, and there has been a big lobby in Australia for those to remain for that reason. Usually now with telephone boxes, it's also a hotspot for mobile Wi-Fi as well. So all of those things do assist women. So we're pleading for the phone boxes to be kept. Mel, what about in your part of the world? Are there domestic violence shelters? How do women deal with the stigma of domestic violence?
Yeah, very much. I think the same as what Bernice has said. There is still a perception that somehow you're not a victim, you're not a survivor. And yes, local country towns, rumour mills still run very hot and very quick. So in terms of anonymity, no, I think that would probably stop a lot of people. I am aware in the state that I live in, Victoria, recently the government put out some figures to show there'd been sharp increases in domestic violence in the last 12 to 18 months with the pandemic. So it's certainly a focus. There's certainly a strong understanding of when people were stuck in their homes for periods of time and stress levels, people were losing their livelihood and so forth, that women are very negatively affected by that. But I think my local area, it's the same as Bernice has said. There are available shelters, but there's not enough. People don't know how to access them. And then there's the concern of what after that? There's shelters for a couple of nights, but what's next? And all those services are pushed to the limits. So yeah, it's definitely an issue in my area as well.
Exactly. And one of the things that I have to say NIWC is doing, we're trying to, through our work with our sister alliances in the domestic violence space, we're trying to change the conversation, moving that idea of shame from the victim to shame on the perpetrator. But again, it's a slow glacial pace. Pip, now you're in a really remote location. What, if anything, is there for DV, domestic violence victims?
Yeah, I think as has been echoed by everyone else, it can be very difficult for victims to seek help. And one of the most powerful things that is being done at the moment is really breaking the stigma for women and even for men to seek help, begin that cycle of change. For women, it's about empowering them and equipping them with knowledge when it's not always financially viable to have a shelter in every small town. The nearest one to me would be about 100 kilometres away. One thing that I've noticed an increase of around breaking the stigma and equipping women with information is targeted information, targeted websites that really support regional, remote and rural women in learning what they can do and what is around. That's certainly in a WA, a Western Australian space. There's websites and organisations that are working towards that, because Western Australia is so vast and we span, from the top to the bottom of Australia, more or less. And so it's such a massive space. So that's a really, really important initiative that I think is making a difference.
I think the other place too that a lot of people find themselves having to go for help for the lack of a shelter or somewhere else is often they'll go to the local hospital or the local doctor's surgery. Now that might be, a long way away, but oftentimes they're the only places that they can seek the help of perhaps a psychologist or a counsellor or someone who can sit down and talk through with them. Police officers are also being trained in rural areas about domestic violence. This is a real change. That's not new. Domestic violence is not new, but it's new for police officers to actually be receiving the right training. And we're also working with doctors to ensure that they ask the right questions, that they can actually determine that a woman is potentially a victim of domestic violence or her children are at risk of violence. Bernice, I know that the yarning circle that we talked about very briefly before is a safe place. Can you expand on that in relation to domestic violence, please?
Yes, I can. With your question around help seeking, that's where this is pointed towards, that if you're able to get the conversation happening where you're coming together as a collective in a yarning circle and that way you've got each other. You have women that are in this space that are able to confidentially and freely speak about what your circumstances that you are, but by means it's non-judgmental, but it's a place where you're able to begin boosting your confidence and having that support with other women around you, that you are not alone, and it's no stranger, but you are able to, like I said, increase your own self-empowerment on that.
I think that's a really good point. It's about that women protecting women, women helping women again, isn't it? It's about them empowering one another to move through an incredibly difficult time. That support is incredibly important from your sisters when that happens. Have another question here, and this is a question about inclusivity. How does the CRT, so the Communications Reference Team, ensure no woman in rural, regional or remote Australia is left behind? Pip.
I think one of the most powerful tools for the Communications Reference Team is the fact that we are so diverse. So I'm a woman in my very, very early 30s. I live in remote Western Australia, and I know that I am a representative for people like me, for not only for my community, but for other women that live in remote Australia and that are maybe my age, that have interests like myself. And I feel that so many of us on the CRT have those special little things that make us, that make us us, and that's our power. Our power is that we are so diverse, and we ensure that we represent a huge range of women across Australia, and that really empowers us to ensure that we are feeding information that is relevant to all of the women, that need to be represented. Yeah.
And Mel, what are your thoughts on that?
I think we've talked a lot about online and social media, and we had a conversation at a recent CRT meeting where we wondered whether we've gone a bit too far down that line. And we have talked about the fact that not everyone can get that access all the time. So for us, not wanting to leave anyone behind, I think we're looking at a variety of ways to reach people. So Bernice has talked about yarning circles. We've talked about whether it's a good old-fashioned meeting in a local hall or a sports club or someone's kitchen table. So for us, I think it's about those variety of ways to get to people. Some people don't have the access to the internet. Other people just don't like talking that way. They want face-to-face. They want to be able to sit down and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and talk to someone and get that face-to-face interaction. So for us, I think it's about using our different approaches and the different platforms that are available to us to make sure that we're reaching people in a space that they're comfortable in.
What about you, Bernice? What do you think about that?
To extend on Pip and Mel from sharing what they have shared about that is, it's really about, like, in my experience, having attained and gained confidence from upskilling myself in a regional area, that going home to my mob, and when I say my mob, that's my family and my nation that I'm connected to. It's my connection to country, so that it will allow for women in my community and in my nation to feel also confident that they have someone that they know. Because as I mentioned in my beginning part of the speech, is that isolation and remoteness can most definitely be a communication barrier. But in saying that, when we are greeted by one of our own, it helps shift that focus around feeling more confident to not feel left behind and to feel inclusive when you are able to attend and join to your country women's association, or attending to a network that is being undertaken in your community, where it may be run by non-Indigenous women, but it is also a place where it can connect you on a level that it is powerful for oneself to use to speak through their cultural lens, and how that is so important for each other to be supporting each other in that process.
I think that's a really important point for a lot of us, that notion of cultural lens as well. And I think particularly so for First Peoples women, absolutely. But I think you're right that you can be involved in circles or safe places that were perhaps not designed for you with your particular culture in mind, but they serve you well. And I think it's what you feel comfortable with, isn't it, Bernice? If you feel comfortable in a particular group, you'll keep going back, won't you?
That's absolutely right. And because we begin to build trust, and when we feel that we are able to trust that there is a stepping stone to feeling confident in building those relationships and with women, and you may not connect with all women, but you may connect with someone, and that someone could be that pathway or door to where you need to go out there and speak up and speak out.
And I think that's probably a really good place to leave our conversation this very early morning for all of us. You know, it's about finding a voice, it's about reaching out, it's about making a connection. And that's how we have all gotten over the barriers in communication that we each find and feel in our daily lives. So thank you, everybody, for being a part of this morning. We really appreciate you joining us, and may the rest of CSW65 be exciting for you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon, morning, evening.
Thanks, Jo.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Jo.
My pleasure.
My fellow colleagues, Pip, Mel.
Exactly. Thank you, ladies. It's been fantastic.
Okay.
I'm going to leave now. Bye.
I'll hit end. Thanks, everyone.